Hello, everyone, and welcome to what we think is our last discussion of the book Home by Marilynne Robinson. But I've thought that a couple of times, and I've been wrong before. So my name is Damon Jensen Heitman. I'm one of the pastors at First Presbyterian Church of Hastings, joined by members and friends of First Pres Hastings. We have been reading our way through Home by Marilynne Robinson. I left my my visual aid at the church this afternoon, so I can't imagine I'm holding it right there. There, Constance is holding it for us, as is Lois. Very nicely done. And yeah, so we've been chatting about the characters, the themes. We've talked about the prodigal son and predestination and perdition and change and forgiveness and fate and destiny and I don't know, just about knickknacks. We've talked about knickknacks and everything else. So I'm finally done reading the book, so we can talk about anything and everything related to home. So I don't have really a designated or intended starting point for us this evening. So I guess anybody can jump in. Yeah.
Last time there was some question about whether interracial marriage would have been allowed in Iowa back in that time, and it would have been that law went away in the 1800s in Iowa, so that wouldn't have been an issue for Jack to have been married to the black girl. That would have been okay. Maybe not accepted within that small town, but still there was no law against it at that point. Yeah.
And I'm guessing, this is Denny, I'm guessing that they were married in St. Louis. Is that close, or in Missouri?
Yeah,
might have been a very different, had a different attitude toward mixed marriages than Iowa did. Jane Marsh talks about, and I can't remember the exact situation, but Jane Marsh talks about they could not get married, I think, in Kansas. Because she is predominantly Cherokee, and they had, I think, come back to Nebraska to get married because Dwight was in grad school, or does that ring any bells?
Yeah, I think they had to change the location of their marriage because of that law.
Yes.
I think so. I mean, it sounds like perhaps legally the situation would have been different in Iowa than in Missouri. I don't imagine that those two states were that different culturally. I don't know. I think from the way that folks in Home talk, there seems to be a good amount of prejudice floating in the ether in Gilead. And for as nervous as, I think it's Della's sister that comes with on the journey, for as nervous as she seems to be, she certainly doesn't want to be out at night in a strange place. So yeah. I think, Constance, you sent a review of the next book, Jack, that was in The Atlantic, I think it was. And I didn't read all of it because I didn't want to spoil the book Jack for myself. But I read enough to read the part where it said that interracial relationships would have been outlawed in Missouri at the time. Does that seem right from that article?
I honestly don't remember.
Okay.
I read a short story, and then I've read a couple different reviews of the various novels in this quartet.
Yeah. So then when I read that, I kind of figured, oh, oh no, I was wrong on what I was just about to say. So I'm not going to say it.
I think it's remarkable, though, in some ways that in 2020, 2021, sometimes we change laws after people demand social change because it's about time. And this one seems to be one of those laws that came through legislation or perhaps the executive branch and just was laid aside in terms of the social context. I'm sure there are other examples of that, but we tend to want to change particularly employment laws and some things now to reflect changes in our social context. And that one was just a rigid social context, apparently, with a law that allowed it.
I'm not sure that Jack and Della are legally married. I think, at least I'm thinking that when she says, yes, I'm his wife, she means his common law wife.
Okay.
Does anybody else read
They
that
had,
differently?
oh no, that was the way I read it too. I mean, particularly, I don't think that they could have been legally married in Missouri. You know, a marriage between, you know, an African-American and a white person. And when those laws finally fell nationwide, that was a result of the Loving decision. Remember the Supreme Court in 1967.
Good.
So,
And there's I think an excellent movie by that title, Loving, which describes that case and the couple in the state of Virginia, if I remember right.
So what do you think of Jack now? Do you like him more than you did at the start of the book? Do you feel that you understand him more? Do you think he's still kind of a wasteful, kind of a throw it away kind of a guy?
What I was thinking is I wish we had a psychologist, handy in our group. That, I mean, Jack has some really, really serious issues going on, either with his father or something deeper, to me, that I would love to get a clinical psychologist involved in this whole discussion.
So it sounds, Denny, like as though you are leaning towards being sympathetic towards Jack.
I'd like to know more. And what I was visiting with Constance today, I did not realize that Jack was the last book in the quartet by 13 years. And for some reason, because my sister had read all four of them, I assumed that Home was the last. Wrong.
I have been sympathetic toward Jack all along. And Anne and I have politely disagreed on that. And I feel like I'm even more sympathetic after I've seen the way that Boughton treats his son. There is no forgiveness, and he's very blunt about it. I think Jack has very sincerely come to Gilead to see if there is any way that he can create a life for himself and Della and their son. And all he wants is some kind of reassurance that he would have an accepting group around him. And he's pretty well reassured by his father that that would not be acceptable, even though his father doesn't know that Della is an African-American woman. Ames isn't really willing to give him much encouragement besides the blessing that he offers at the end of Gilead. Glory, I think, of course, you know, at the end does meet Della and would have welcomed her as she promised her brother that she would have, even when she didn't know that Della was African American. I think Jack comes back very sincerely, and he doesn't do, I mean, besides trying to kill himself, he doesn't do anything harmful to anyone while he's back. So I think he has changed. And there is this one line that I just turned to on 276, where he is talking to Glory and he says, I wish I could have lived here comfortably just like the rest of you. And then he says, you know, I tried it out once or twice. Then he said, I know why people watched me. I'm not even sure that was what made me uneasy. I think it made me feel safer sometimes. I used to test it, stir up a little trouble to make sure the old fellow was still keeping an eye on me. Sometimes I'd be out in the barn in the loft listening to the piano, all of you singing My Darling Clementine, and thinking, you know, maybe they've all forgotten about me. And it felt like death in a way. So that's, I think, as close as we get to an explanation for why Jack stole things or, you know, acted out as a younger man.
No.
And I'm through now.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say that the Reverend didn't forgive Jack, I also noticed that in another area of the book, he, if I remember correctly, doesn't really forgive himself either, because he did not baptize that first baby. So
there are a couple different times when Bowden, you know, puts his hands over his face and cries and says, what a sinful man I am. But I don't know what to make of that. I really don't. I don't know whether he's sincere or not.
Yeah. I mean, maybe he can't forgive himself, or, I mean, I don't know. But I thought that was an interesting comment for him to make too, you know, because he did not baptize that baby. He felt bad about it.
Yeah, and you have to wonder, well, then why didn't he baptize the baby?
Yeah. Yeah. But then it also said that Presbyterians didn't necessarily believe you had to be baptized. Is that true?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, because if Bowden if he's a thoroughgoing Calvinist, which we kind of assume that he is, and if he buys into this concept of the elect and this concept of predestination, and that you're assigned to heaven or to hell from the moment that you're born, then there is a certain kind of frivolousness to baptism, and you might even say that there's, if you took it to its extreme, you might also say there's kind of a frivolousness to forgiveness, and to seeking forgiveness, and if Jack has gotten it ingrained in himself that he describes himself as that he's always in perdition, perdition meaning hell, and that there's no escape for him. His life is perdition. Then what's the point of seeking forgiveness? What's the point of trying to make amends. If you know that no one's going to believe you for starters, and you might not even believe yourself. I don't know. And you were gonna hop in.
Yeah, I was just that what Bowden said about not baptizing the baby. He says it as if this is going to be a terrible thing for Jack that the baby wasn't baptized. And I mean, all along at this point in the novel, I mean, it's pretty obvious that Jack is not a believer. And so I thought that was really odd. That Bowden's is projecting or something, obviously he's upset, from his perspective, but that it would also bother someone else who doesn't look at things the same way. I thought that was very strange.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I should say also that and this is where we miss Greg, who's the Presbyterian presidente. But I mean, in the Reformed tradition, we wouldn't say that baptism is necessary for a person to enter into heaven or for a person's salvation, that it's a sign of the love and of the presence of God that we believe to be present with everyone, but that it wouldn't be a necessary thing in order for a person to be saved, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think the contemporary term is do-overs, but I was just thinking as you were saying that, maybe he thought that he could do something for Jack's son, for Jack's child, that he couldn't have done for Jack. And that was part of his sadness. And if all he could do is something that was ritual, then that was at least something that he could do to maybe get the baby off on the right foot. Because he seemed to be really, I mean, he worked hard to make him conform all his life. And he thought that effort was enough to at least satisfy the status quo, but it wasn't a very good way to raise Jack. It just didn't happen.
The other thing I found interesting, I'm kind of skipping around here, but on page 2, I don't have the right glass, 220, and they're talking about predestination and stuff. They're talking about grace, and they said, what I underlined was religion is human behavior. Grace is the love of God. Two are very different things, which I thought that was kind of an interesting comment. And I think they were talking about fate and predestination and all that too. But
Who says that, Lois?
Well, his father said it, is how I took it. It says grace, his father said. They were talking or, having a conversation about fate and predestination. And let me change glasses, sorry.
You're fine.
I can't
Is
read
this part of the porch conversation?
Yeah, it is part of the porch conversation.
Okay.
I think Ames is there too, right? Or
Yes.
Conversations
Yes.
before, yeah.
On that very next page, I wonder, well, you may not be through with what you wanted to talk about.
No, that's fine.
Lois.
Yeah. Go ahead.
On I was really confused by this, and maybe somebody can help me out. He brings up the idea that, he brings up this Reverend Ames's sermon, which had seemed to be aimed at Jack, and then says, it seemed to me another text very relevant to your subject would have been the story of David and Bathsheba. And that might, I don't think that's Jack talking. It may be his father. And then Jack says, as I read that story, the child died because his father committed a sin.
Mhm.
And then he asks, if you believe a man might be punished by the suffering of his child, if a child might suffer to punish the father for his sins or his unbelief. And it kind of goes back and forth between, is it the father's son or father's fault or the child's fault? And does the punishment go back and forth? And I really got lost there.
Yeah. So I think that the reference to David has King David has a child that dies as punishment for David's.
Is it his child with Bathsheba?
I'm not entirely 100% sure. Well, I think so, but I would have to go back and take a look. But part of the story of David and Bathsheba is that Bathsheba was married to someone else,
Right.
to someone who was in David's army, and David arranges for that person to die in battle, so that he can have Bathsheba, and then he
arranges for Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba, and he won't do it because he's following the rules of the army.
Yeah, because he's too good of a loyal subject to do that. Yeah, but that conversation, now that I know the end of the story, and now that I know more of Jack's conversation, or Jack's life, I suppose, I'd imagine that I thought that conversation was about the child that he had with Annie Wheeler. I think that was her name. But now that we're returning to it, and now that I know the end of the book, I assume that conversation is also about his son Robbie.
Right. But it seems also to suggest that perhaps Jack suffers because of Boughton, or Boughton suffers because of Jack. And
maybe.
that way wrong?
I was kind of thinking that too, but then when you flip the page on what you were reading at the top, well, like on 222, Glory's thinking that Jack has forgotten that Ames also lost a child years ago.
Right.
So was he being punished also?
Yeah. And Ames's son is about to lose a father.
Right.
I mean, that sermon, it could be about any of them.
Okay.
I think that sermon that Ames gives about Hagar and Ishmael,
Right.
and about fathers abandoning their children, I think in Gilead, from Ames's perspective, he's giving that sermon about himself, and that he feels that
he wasn't there. That's right. He wasn't there for the baby's birth.
And that he feels that he is about to abandon his son.
Okay. All right.
And his wife, and he doesn't have any money apparently to pass along to them, and send them out into the wilderness to fend for themselves.
Okay.
And it's man, and this happens all the time with sermons, right? That everybody hears a sermon from their own context and from their own setting in life, and you give a sermon from I give a sermon from my setting and from my context in life. And Greg says this all the time. He says when he gives a sermon, he's giving it to himself as much as anyone else. And, you know, it falls in with all of this. It's just nothing but misunderstandings in these books, right? Jack hears it, he assumes it's about him, and it could rightly be applied to him. Ames gives it, and I think Ames thinks it's about himself, and it could rightly be applied to him as well.
Okay, I never even thought of that.
No, I hadn't thought of that either. It also, I mean, here's another example of a situation in which these characters that seem so different from each other have something else in common.
Mhm.
You know, this situation, you know, with their children.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then there's Glory just sitting and listening to it all. Go ahead, Lois.
Sorry, can you tell me more about the bottom of that page when they're, you know, because they talk about, well, Jack makes a comment in the middle of that page about, you know, Ames says David's child returned to the Lord, but then Jack is like, you hope a child will have a life that is what David prayed for, and you hope he will be safe. You hope he'll learn more than bitterness, I think. You hope that people will be kind. So he's talking about that, but then further down, it says his father said, that night you were born was such a terrible night. I prayed and prayed just like David and Ames did too. And we thought we pulled you through, saved your life, didn't we? But there's so much more to it than that. What's he talking about there? Was there something in Gilead that talks about that?
You know, I think this is the first time we hear about that, but I think we're supposed to understand that Jack had a very difficult birth, and both he and his mother. Yeah, I don't think there's anything.
Mom didn't die, did she? Giving birth to him?
No, she didn't.
No.
And if she had, it would have been very like, you know, what happened with Ames's wife, who died in childbirth, and the child died. Ames's first wife. But I think this is the first we've heard of the difficulty of Jack's birth.
Okay. I wasn't sure if that was in a different book, and I just hadn't seen it.
Yeah. And I suppose if he did come close to dying while he was being born, then there's a lot of religious symbolism in that. And then later when he tries to take his own life, well, that would have been his second near-death experience and rebirth, I suppose, in life. But
yeah, I was noticing, just looking over these sections again, that when Teddy arrives, he says to his brother Jack, I'm your brother, Jesus Christ. I can't believe you're here. And then Jack says, well, you can look at the wound in my side if you want. But it's almost like he's calling Jack Jesus Christ. And then doing the Doubting Thomas thing.
Well, and then also remember Jack and the injury to the hand. You know, that's another possible Christ reference, I think. Well, and maybe just the idea that Jack is the one who's been sacrificed, so that the rest of the family can do what they do somehow. That he's some kind of scapegoat. I'm not sure that occurred to me as I was seeing these references.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna try to switch our gears a little bit, but I think, I mean, for me, Jack ends the novel as much of an enigma as he was when he started it, and he kind of ends in the same place that he started it. He's out to wander the world again, and out to have another series of near misses, it seems, with folks. But the novel ends with Bowden on his deathbed. It seems to be on his way out anytime soon. And Glory gets the house, or will get the house, and seems to decide that that's okay. She's going to stay there and keep the house in case Jack ever comes back, or in case Jack's son ever wants to stop by. Last week, when Anne and Constance and Jenny and I spoke together, we talked about Glory. And let me ask the question this way: at the end of the novel, do you think that Glory is trapped, or do you think that Glory is contented?
My personal view is that I think at the very end that Della and young Robert, redefined the house and Glory's mission from one of despair to finding, the purpose of that house, redefined in her mind and left her in a much more positive feeling. Just that's what my takeaway was.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think the house means to her now, Denny, that it didn't before?
That she found out through Della, just how much Jack had talked about the house in a loving way, and infused that, to Della, and by definition or explanation to their son, whose age, we're not quite sure of. To be able to carry on, a new generation which venerates that house and that home. I think the magnetic attraction of the title of the book, is kind of defined there in those last couple of pages of coming back home again. It's almost irresistible for so many of us.
It's irresistible, and yet, I mean, I guess I don't read the ending quite the same. Glory seems to be content, but as I look on as a reader, she seems to be content with so little. The son might come back sometime, and so she's going to stay in that house, which is basically a trap for her. She had wanted to get out of there, and so I guess I'm seeing something darker at the end, I think, than others are seeing.
Yeah, she may see it as a come to a kind of peace with it, but that peace may not be really in her best interest.
Yeah, that's kind of my thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think, like I said this at one of our other discussions. If if you look back at the way the novel opens, I mean, it kind of comes full circle. Home to stay, Glory. Yes, her father said, and her heart sank. And I would think her heart would be sinking even more after all she's been through and you know, with her father and with Jack and everything she's tried to do, you know, for the family.
Yeah.
Good point, Ann.
Mhm. Yeah. When do you think that Bowden decided to leave the house to her?
She's the only one that hasn't really landed besides Jack.
Like when she walked back in that door and he said home to stay, Glory, yes. Do you think that he had already made the arrangements to give the house to her? Do you think he decided that after she'd been there for the couple of months? I can't imagine that how he would have been able to do that without her knowing while she was in the house. Chief, you're nodding your head.
Well, I think he may very well have figured out that she was never married, and that was a big story all along. And now she came home, and she didn't, at that point, really didn't have any other choice but to stay there.
Excuse me.
At the end, she could have sold the house and left town. She didn't have to come, she didn't have to stay there because Jack wasn't coming back. He was done with it. He was just going to go off and be Jack like he'd always been. He was Jack, and that was just going to continue on. And Glory had a way out if she wanted it. She apparently chose not to. We don't really know. Maybe there'll be another book.
Yeah.
Sometimes we haven't been giving these people enough credit to understand each other or even accept who they are. The only other person that came back was the guy that was a doctor. And the rest of them only showed up the holidays and then went on their merry way again.
Yeah, they certainly don't seem to be very invested in what's going on back home or at the house. Yeah, and I think you're right. The characters do seem to do a fair amount of talking past one another, but they also do seem to do a fair amount of seeing through one another. Also, and there's lots of times where Glory, even if she can't really name or put her finger on what Jack is holding back, she knows that there's something else there for sure.
That he's not going to tell them, but she knows there's something. Yeah.
And I suppose I would assume that that Bowden might be able to tell these things as well. I don't know. I assume parents have a relatively decent way of telling when their children are holding something back from them. I don't know, but
yeah, I think you do have a certain degree of, well, there's something else there, but then maybe we'll find out what it is at some point in time. I usually didn't press on those things because usually they weren't life threatening. They were more like life learning. This is what happened if you do that kind of thing. Yeah. So, you talked about that sermon, and to a certain extent, if the shoe fits, you wear it. And you listen to a sermon and it hits you one way and it hits your neighbor a different way. But still, there's a lesson there if you were listening. That's all.
Yeah.
I almost wonder too, given the matrix of the 1960s Vietnam, flower children, the rise, the new generation hippies, that if you know, Jack is I think he's the youngest of the male children. Is that correct? You know, simply takes off for St. Louis, gets caught up in urban protest, you know, whether it's racial, anti-Vietnam, and becomes so estranged from his very rigid father that there's not much left to talk about. I can see that in my own father's relationship with me at that same time.
Denny, remember though that this novel is set in 1956, you know, when, or either 54 or 56, where there were protests, but this is before hippies.
Ah, true.
And so the hippie thing wouldn't be something that's there for Jack, at least not yet. If he's still alive 10 years later, you know, maybe he'd find happiness in a hippie colony.
Well, there are hints of that, it seemed to me, and in the conversation he has with Glory. You're absolutely right, I think, on the timing. When he's talking about Vietnam, and he's talking about you know, racial unrest in the South and Birmingham.
No, wait, he's not talking about Vietnam, is he?
I think so.
He's talking about racial unrest, but I think this is before Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah, he makes well, he doesn't. Bowden makes a couple of references to I guess there's a few references to Egypt and what's going on in Egypt. And I just finally did a Google search of the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, part of the decolonization of Africa and Asia, the Cold War and the Arab Cold War.
Damon, I think he's referring to Gamal Nasser's seizure of the Suez Canal in 1956, which was a huge blow up between Eisenhower, if I remember right, between Eisenhower and Eden, who was the British Foreign Secretary at that time, you know, and cutting off, you know, world trade coming up through the Suez Canal, who was going to own it, who were going to collect the royalties for shipping.
Okay. What else?
Going back to Glory and keeping the house, I think after she met this Della's son, or Jack's son, I don't think she wants to get rid of the house now. She has to keep it the same. So if he comes back, he will see where his dad grew up. So I don't know, doesn't want to change anything. Even if she did want to, she doesn't know what Jack told him about. So it kind of sounded like she probably wouldn't change anything because she didn't want to change what Jack told him that he liked about the house.
Yeah. So the question then, I think, Lois, do you think that's good for Glory, or do you think that's sad for Glory?
I probably sad in some ways to know she can't change it, but I kind of can relate to her in some way. I can relate to the dad because I can't throw things away either. And so I get that part. It's like, what if somebody wants it someday? But that was my mom's, or that was my dad's, that was, you know, Charlie's parents. So I don't want to get rid of them, kind of thing, because that meant a lot to them. So if Jack's son comes back, she wants him to be able to see that. So I don't know, it's kind of sad because it may not mean anything to Jack's son. He may never come back. You just don't know.
And so Jack essentially goes off and says, here, Glory, you do X for my son. You know, that's
So
I
do you
don't think
think
that's
Jack,
exactly it.
did Jack leave because his father was dying and all the siblings were coming home, or did he leave because he knew Della was coming? Do we know that?
Jack gonna Jack. Who knows?
I think
Yeah,
part
Dan.
of the fact that Della was coming, I think, caused some of that leaving. Yeah. But earlier, hadn't Jack told Glory to sell the house and leave? Am I just dreaming that up?
I don't. I think he says
Oh,
that
go
she.
ahead and change stuff. I don't care if you change stuff. That's fine. Go ahead and do that.
Yeah, I think he says that she could sell it, but she. There's a scene somewhere where she sees Jack kind of looking admiringly at the house. And this connects back to Constance. You bring this up, that Jack saying that when he was a child, he wished that he could have lived there like everybody else did. And so I think Glory sees it as Jack is never going to say, keep this place so that I can come back sometime. I think she's sort of resigned, and she says something to the effect of, well, now I have to keep it just because he looked admiringly at it or something. And I guess my take on it was that she's hanging on to it in some sort of hope that he might come back in the future, or that Robbie might come at some point in the future. Yeah,
I think that's true too. But if she did sell it, where would she go? I mean,
anywhere else?
She could go anywhere.
but would she?
It was.
Well,
Yeah.
she had taught in Des Moines. And of course, if she got a job in Des Moines, that would mean that she was, a teacher with, excellent preparation and all that sort of thing. And so I would imagine she could, if she doesn't want to leave Iowa, there are lots of high schools in Iowa where she could teach. And she wouldn't have to be there in that doily infested house that drives her nuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And why can't she teach in Gilead? Has she ever tried?
Well, and she thinks about that too. Yeah.
There was something about she was going to go down and tell the principal she'd never been married, and so then she could teach again or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That if they heard what had actually happened, they think they'd get over it, and then we could all move on. Yeah.
Yeah. She thinks I could go and talk to the principal and tell him that I was never actually married, and eventually the talk would die down.
Yeah.
But I think that's the main reason why she isn't, up to that point at least, she has not wanted to talk to anybody else in town. She only goes to church on Sundays essentially to keep Dad happy. She would prefer to have the groceries delivered, but Jack kind of insists on picking them up. So embarrassment, I guess, has kept her from doing that. I don't know.
It's kind of strange. Old Jack didn't want to go downtown or be in the stores either. And you'd think, well, he's thinking people will know and remember when I was a bad boy when I was a kid. But this is 20 years, for Pete's sake. People that really knew that would be his dad's age, or maybe Dad or age. So where was that fear coming from? I didn't quite follow that.
Yeah,
I think there's,
sorry, hold on a second. Yeah, Constance, I think you were trying to get in earlier, but you are on mute. And so you're still on mute, Constance. Nope, can't hear
Can you
you.
unmute her, Damon?
I can ask her to unmute. I can, but yeah, I mean, my sense of that, Dad, while we try to figure this out, was I think to a certain extent, this self-image that Jack has is just so ingrained into his own person that he struggles to see himself differently. He struggles to see himself as changed. And so if he can't see himself as changed or as different, then how's he gonna, he can't possibly imagine that anyone else would see him as changed or different, I don't think. We still can't get Constance off mute.
Damon, if you put your mouse over her screen or image on there, there's 3 little blue dots in the upper right corner. Can you click on
Yes, but
that?
none of them say unmute. There's ask to
about when you,
unmute, which I've clicked several times.
click on participants and look at those?
Just hold the space bar down.
That would be Constance.
We'll have to come back.
Oh, can't do it.
okay. I would say just one thing while Constance figures out we all figure out the unmuting thing, and that is, I thought there was also an element of kind of immaturity with both Jack and Glory, thinking everybody's looking at them all the time. You know how some like 13-year-olds, I mean, they just think that they're the focus of everybody's attention, where actually other people might look at him for a minute. Oh, it's Jack. Gee, I wonder what he's and what's going on with him. And then they go back to their lives. I mean, they really don't give it much thought. I think there could be some of that too.
Yeah, even at the end of the book, Jack goes over to have one last conversation with Ames. I assume reveals to him that he was involved with an African-American gal in St. Louis and has a child. And Ames comes over to the house and offers him some money and says, I thought you might want to take a trip to St. Louis. And Jack interprets it as he was trying to get rid of me. And Glory says, he could have just been being friendly. You know, so I think there's something where he just can't imagine that people would think of him differently. Constance, I'm going to try to make you a co-host, and we'll see if that gives you any other options. There's got to be a mute button around there someplace. I don't understand. There's a little microphone button, and you click it. Let's try that. There we go. Let's see if that does anything or not. No, can't hear you. No, somewhere
Damon,
towards the bottom of your screen, there should be a little microphone button. It should say mute under it. And if you click on that, that should work. Maybe you could try holding the space bar. We could try holding the space bar while you talk. No, nothing. We hope that you shared all your keen and penetrating insights already this evening, Constance.
Damon, if you want to try to make me co-host, I can try to get her unmuted.
Okay, we can try that too. We're about out of time.
Yeah.
We'll keep working at it. Maybe I just make everybody a co-host. You're all co-hosts.
Would anybody like to comment on the final lines on page 325? He is young. He cannot know that my whole life has come down to this moment, that he has answered his father's prayers. The Lord is wonderful.
this is Glory, right? This is Glory's kind of perspective right at the end of the novel after she's seen.
Glory reflecting on young Robert's visit, 1 foot in and 1 foot out of the car.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of it, Denny?
Thanks, Damon.
You did.
I've already said my piece, but I think Ann is more correct, but it just sounds like to me that she has found new meaning in what that house is. Now, whether that meaning is a good meaning, as Ann mentioned earlier, or somebody mentioned earlier, that's something else. But my whole life has come down to this moment. I think Glory, in some ways, she was almost being conned by this fiance, because they were an item for what, 10, 12 years? Do I remember that right?
I don't think she was almost being conned by this guy. She was conned.
Yeah.
He took all their money.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it was almost a willing con, is what I'm almost.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Thank you, everyone. I need to go. This has been really interesting. Good ideas, everybody.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Yeah, Danny, I mean, there is there's obviously this recurring theme of, are we just kind of, are we predestined to our lots in life, right? And this idea that Glory's thinking at the end of the novel, I think, moves her into accepting that kind of perspective on the world, right? That all of her path was to get her to that point, to be at that place on that day, at that time, to see Robbie, to meet him, to give him this memento of his father, and to be in a place to welcome him back, and therefore welcome his father back anytime that he wanted, right? So I think that I've forgotten her, Glory. I think that her headspace moves towards that kind of an understanding of how life works at the end of the novel. And we may or may not agree with that, I think.
It's good observation. Thank you.
I don't know. Sharon, what do you think?
I think that's as good a thing as I could imagine. I'm kind of still perplexed about all the combinations of people and their interactions with each other. I think she's always a kind of a sign of hope. Glory is looking for what will happen next that will be helpful. Because I think she's grown up thinking all along that if she learns about the things that her parents have taught her, that she will continue along a life that she's supposed to have. Very much a believer in the status quo, if you will, and that she still believes in that.
Yeah. One of the other things about Gloria that I always go back to is that she is the one that, when speaking about Jack, talking to Jack about Jack's first child, she is the one who says that there was more than shame in that, right? And I think possibly now she's arrived at a point where she sees more than just shame in having to come back to the house, right? That there's more than just sorrow in this for her now. That there is some sort of a purpose, I guess. So, well, I think that we are at kind of a place where we might want to wrap up. Any other stray thoughts that folks were itching to get in or to talk about? Anybody else wondering where Ames's cat has been this whole time? Or is that just me? It's probably just me, but.
Does anybody want to suggest another book for maybe next spring?
I'm thinking I want to read the next one in the series, but I don't know which one that is exactly.
Mhm. I think if I'm reading Constance's lips correctly, I believe that it is Lila would be the next book in the quartet, as it were. I'd be happy to take a look at diving into Lila. We could wait until the new year, start sometime maybe January, February, or something along those lines. I would be happy to take a break from Jack for a little while. Kind of.
It's really interesting for those of us that have read Lila, now have read Home, to see Lila as one of the more grounded people in this whole cast of characters. And to reflect back on her early beginning and where she came from is just an amazing stream of consciousness of finding herself finally.
Don't have to read.
That's it. So, okay. I'll send out some more information. We'll look into maybe reading through Lila in the springtime, and we'll step out of the little town of Gilead for a couple of months at least, so and put our feet back in our own towns, I suppose. But my thanks to all of you folks for joining us for these conversations. My thanks to Constance and Jenny and Anne for being willing to hop in on the off weeks as well. So, and I think this has provided us lots of good fodder for conversation and for thinking about theology and faith and how we might understand ourselves and understand the world, and given us some more entry points into that prodigal son narrative that comes up almost all the time in our churches. So thank you all, and have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye all.